Yes, hello once again, and another warm welcome back to Classic Dirt Bike TV. Yes, welcome back to CDB TV, and if you're a brand new subscriber to my channel, then welcome aboard, and I do hope you can find material in here to satisfy your two-wheel needs with regards looking at these old school vintage and classic dirt bikes. Now, we're only just about a week away now from our first outdoor or indoor event of 2025, which will of course will be the Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show on the 8th and 9th of February. So we're just trying to do our best to fill in until we make the journey south to Telford. And don't forget, you can see all of the bikes from that two-day show here on my channel soon after. So if you haven't already subscribed to CDB TV, then now is a very good time to do that small thing. Right, so let's crack on with another race dirt bike from back in the day. Now, if you're into your two-wheel trials machines, then you may appreciate this next video that we're going to feature. So let's get down to business and take a look at Deryck Scott's lovely JCM 240 trials machine.
Now, certainly in the last few months, we seem to be coming across more and more examples of these kind of trials bikes, which is of course quite a good thing, because these are still dirt bikes after all, although most of the two-wheelers that we normally feature here on CDB TV are predominantly classic or vintage scrambles bikes. But when we do get the chance, it's always good to take a look at something slightly different to keep up the interest of all of the subscribers and the browsers who take the time to look at my content. So this is another interesting machine that I came across just a few weeks ago, and this was another bike that was quite local to me, and I think it was only about 20 minutes drive from where I actually stayed. So it was just a short drive to the owner's vicinity to grab some video clips and pictures of this rare machine that was owned and recently raced by Deryck Scott. So at the risk of repeating myself and what I've already mentioned many times in the past, these kind of trials bikes aren't really my usual bread and butter machines that we normally feature, and when it comes to details and specs of a particular trials machine, then I've usually no idea whatsoever with regards their components and bits and pieces, or whoever even put them together. So as in most of these trials bikes cases, I've had to spend quite a few hours surfing the net and getting in touch with some of my more learned contacts who usually have more better informed knowledge of these different makes of balance bikes. So anyhow, this quite nice looking trials bike, up until I actually went along to film it, I'd never even seen or even heard of JCM motorcycles, but as I said, after some research and background information from the owner, Deryck, I did eventually manage to come up with just a few points regarding their existence. So apparently these JCM trials bikes were originally manufactured by French trials rider Joël Corroy, who ran a very successful trials competition bike shop called Trial 70 in Vesoul in France. And from what I've learned, he formed JCM back in 1983. Now, Joel at that time wasn't just a motorcycle dealer, he was also quite a decent trials rider and a very good engineer, and it was because of his passion for motorcycles and riding trials bikes that spurred him on to develop and market his own brand of off-road trials machines that consisted basically of a compact steel-tubed chassis and modern style single shock rear suspension. But on the other hand, Joel Carroy's intentions and his visions were certainly admirable, but there's a big difference between the concept of building a bike and then completing and marketing the finished article. And Joel Carroy poured in vast amounts of his own money to try and make it happen, and although he initially built some superbly competitive machines, he unfortunately couldn't get further backing from some of his French counterparts to continue his dream, and he would run out of money and eventually end up selling JCM to a French company called Strife in 1986. Although, as you can imagine, being such a small concern, Joel Carroy's JCM never actually built a whole lot of bikes, and our 240 Europa here is without doubt one of those very rare survivors. And if you actually surf the internet or other trials related group pages, it's quite surprising just how very little information and background is available about JCM trials bikes, and the scraps of information that I managed to scrape up from my various sources still didn't manage to paint the full picture of Joel Carroy and his motorcycle company. Now, nevertheless, the current owner of our rare JCM is this man here, Deryck Scott, who he says bought the bike from a collector in Yorkshire back in 2024. And although the previous owner did have it in his possession for many years, Deryck told me that he hardly used it, and consequently then sold the bike on to Deryck, who tells me that he's now wanting to sell the bike again, as he's got his eye on a nice Greaves Scottish trials bike that he wants to buy and compete on. So maybe if you're in the market for a super rare French classic, then I'll supply a contact email to any interested parties near the end of this video. So according to my research, there were at one time 10 different interpretations of JCM bikes, although their best selling top 3 models that they made were their basic budget bike, which was strangely called the Weekend, which was really aimed at novice and brand new riders. Then they also had their Europa model that was for more experienced riders, and at the top of the pile, their flagship bike was called the SR, which was really aimed at top class professionals who wanted to use the bike at big events like maybe European Championships. Now, some of the specs of our featured French fancy are that this bike is a 1989 Europa 240 machine, and by all accounts it's said to be a quite rare bike as well, due to the fact that JCM was a relatively small firm, so their annual output of machines was somewhat limited. And again, this model here is of course the middle of the range Europa bike, which, as I said, is a 240, which was built using generally decent motorcycle components, although if you opted for the much more upmarket top of the range SR model, then those were usually built with top quality parts, including things like Öhlins shocks and proper Michelin Trials tyres and a few other high-end components. But let's start by taking a quick gander at our JCM's frame, which was a relatively light gauge tubular steel type construction and very minimalist, as of course all trials bikes are and were in 1989, although with the kind of off-road work that these trials bikes did, the tubular construction of this bike chassis was certainly light and strong enough to cope with most of the obstacles in the terrain that this little machine would come across. But by all accounts, the JCM frame was certainly well designed, and by my reckoning, the chassis does look like it's made up of two parts here, with the front down tube part and the rear subframe, using the engine as a kind of stressed member to bring the two sections together. And there's also that alloy bash plate or engine guard that helps to bolt both units as one solid chassis and engine combination. Furthermore, the bike's rear swing arm, or Mono Pro as JCM called it at the time, was once more a relatively small box section steel type swing arm, which as per the bike's frame were all part and parcel of a trials bike's construction for that period. But when you compare it to the size and maybe the dimensions of a similar sized scrambles or motocross bike, it's probably about half the size, but then again, as I said, its size and dimensions are proportionate to what kind of environment the bike's going to be used in. And when you fast forward maybe 20 or 30 years to our modern day trials frames and swing arms, I expect that they are now being made in lightweight alloy, or maybe even something a bit more exotic. But for 1989, steel was still king for all manner of motorcycle frames, and our steel Mono Pro JCM unit is almost bicycle style in its construction. But while we're here on the chassis parts, I expect that these extra wide footrests are the original Joel Carroy pegs that he bolted onto the bike when it was first put together in that year. But if you're a trials rider, as you know, it's quite important to have a decent set of footrests that have got plenty support for your feet and your boots, because when you do spend so much time standing up on these bikes, it's almost mandatory to make sure that you have the best possible footrest that you can lay your feet down on, so that you can have the maximum amount of control by moving your body weight from one side of the bike to the other. And these pegs here certainly look like they are just a job. Anyhow, moving on to the engine department of our JCM. Now, because Joel Carroy and his JCM bike building company were only a small cottage type industry, they never really had the funds or the backing of some of the much bigger trials bike builders. So naturally, JCM never managed to design or produce their own engine. And from what I've learned about this bike here from its owner, Deryck, this power plant is basically a gas bottom end with a JCM clutch and ignition covers, although the barrel and the cylinder head were also said to be proper JCM components. And with regards its specification, this engine is of course a 240cc two-stroke with a 6-speed gearbox and the usual wet oil-cooled multi-plate clutch. And the engine was fed its fuel through what looks like to me possibly an Italian Dell'Orto, or it could maybe even be a British-made amyl carburetor, but either way, this carburetor fed its fuel into the barrel through a 6-petal reed valve block. And with regards to the fuel system and air filter assembly, we'll get to that just shortly. And once again, here at the spark side of our JCM, it was a modern style CDI, or capacitor discharge ignition, that was used to supply the sparks. And although we did say that this was basically a gas engine, it was still very common in the 1970s and even in the 1980s for bike manufacturers who were given supply engines for their bikes to change the outer casings just to try and keep their own identity. And as you can see, JCM were certainly no different in that respect. And JCM continued putting their own brand name on this clutch cover, which had inside an oil-cooled clutch that I think, as I remember from my information, had 6 friction plates, and the clutch was driven directly from the crankshaft by a simple straight cut gear. So you had no silly things like primary chains to connect the engine and the transmission together. So this tooth gear assembly was much quieter and more reliable than those rattly primary chains. And as I mentioned earlier, most of the bottom running gear parts on this engine were gas, but JCM fitted their own barrel and cylinder head. For what reason, I don't actually know, because you'd think that if they were using a supplier engine, then they'd simply use the barrel and the head as well to try and keep the costs down. Although the barrel, as you can see, had these little rubber shock absorbers in between the fins to try and cut down on the noise and any vibrations produced by the engine. However, that brings us on to a couple of other quite intriguing little factors about our JCM Europa 240, and that's the fuel and the air supply system for the engine, which is all contained underneath this fiberglass bodywork. And then to enable you to gain access to the fuel and air system, it was a very simple job of just removing 2 Allen bolts at the front of the panel and another single bolt here at the back of what they called a motorcycle seat in 1989. Now, at the time I took these pictures, we didn't really have any kind of tools available to remove the bodywork on our JCM, but when we did get the bike back to Deryck's house, he kindly removed the bodywork so that we could have a much closer look inside. So with that body panel removed, you can see exactly how the fuel system works, and basically you filled the fuel here at the top of the frame's backbone, and then it ran down into a plastic storage tank that was located just underneath what would have been roughly where the bike's seat was on the bodywork. So this plastic fuel cell would probably have held just under the 2 gallons of pre-mix, which was usually more than enough to satisfy our gas JCM engine on even the longest of trials events. But you can see just how neatly the fuel tank wraps around the bike's rear subframe, and in addition to that, it also acts as a rear splash guard to help keep dust, dirt and all the crap away from that single rear shock at the back. On the other hand, the intake system for the air into the carburetor starts here, and inside this plastic cover we have a foam type filter that was quite easily removed for any maintenance and servicing by removing this single nut. And it also looks like somebody's added a bit more air holes just to try and get more oxygen into that JCM engine. Then, of course, the air intake goes through the filter and then switches to the left side of the bike and then continues down this plastic ducting, where it then makes an almost 90-degree turn into the back of the carburetor. So you can see that the fuel and the air system on this little bike is a bit unconventional, to say the least, but in practice it all appeared to work perfectly well while the bike was being ridden. And I suppose by using the chassis backbone as part of the fuel system and channeling the air remotely to the carburetor, it kept the bike super slim and very compact, as you can see. But it's certainly an intriguing layout for a fuel and air system. Now, be that as it may, when it came to choosing front suspension on our French-built JCM, it's no surprise that Joel Carroy chose these Italian Marzocchi forks for his bike, because these were basically your go-to suspension systems for many off-road bikes of the 1970s and 1980s. And although these Marzoccis were miles away in terms of today's high-tech front forks, even for the late 1980s, these Marzoccis were still perfect for the likes of our lightweight JCM trialer. Although, having said that, there still wasn't much scope for being able to tune or adjust these Marzoccis for the likes of rebound or compression. But as I've commented many times before on these early motorcycle suspension systems, you could still improve on them slightly by maybe trying different spring rates or different weights of fork oil to make them to your liking. And also here on the front of our JCM, we appear to have an Italian Brembo hydraulic disc brake and caliper, which again was just a single pot piston affair, but it was more than adequate to stand our JCM up on its head when it was used to kick and swing the back of the bike around into a position to tackle an obstacle. So this single piston hydraulic unit did work extremely well, because the 240 JCM was a compact and super light two-wheeled little flicker. And while we're still here in the wheel department, both the front and the rear wheels on our Joel Carroy bike are lightweight alloy rims. Although as to their actual manufacturer, I'm not entirely sure, because normally the maker's brand is usually stamped on the shoulder of the rim of the wheel, but as you can see, that's obscured by these JCM rim tapes that go around the outside. But both of the wheels have been fitted with a nice pair of very high quality professional Michelin Trials tyres. However, in contrast to that front Brembo hydraulic brake, we appear to have what looks like an AVP disc brake here on the back, which I don't know if it's as it should be for this 1989 JCM, but it still appears to look correct. And also, if you look at the inner circumference there of the disc, you can see just how it meshes onto the hub by using those what looks like gear teeth that are cut into the internal diameter of the disc, which again is quite unusual. And also on the swing arm there is the adjuster for the rear chain drive, so that you can keep everything at the right tension with regards drive and suspension movement. And you can also see that to operate that rear brake, the pedal was just a short and stubby affair that was tucked in good and tight into the JCM's chassis. So I expect that with a big chunky boot on this right hand side of the footpeg, there would be quite a few missed braking operations. But with regards this rear drive sprocket, I think this part here will have been changed many times during its 36 years of doing trials events. So this part here is obviously not the JCM stock original from '89. But there was one part that we kind of overlooked while we were hovering around the JCM's engine, and it's this exhaust system that, as you can see, was quite a nice, tight and compact design that came from the barrel and then did a quick left turn and then went over the top of the cylinder head onto the right hand side of the bike, where it appeared to go then into a primary exhaust collector box before coming out at the rear into a stock standard mild steel tailpipe. So whether this was maybe just some kind of spark arrestor before the fumes were pumped out through the tailpipe, I'm not entirely sure. But as I said, the tailpipe was just a simple mild steel part and not made of alloy as you'd might imagine on an '89 trials bike. But hopefully we'll be able to have a quick listen to the exhaust note from this tailpipe sometime later in the video. Anyhow, I guess by now you've already gathered that it's a single rear monoshock that's fitted to our '89 JCM, although to actually find out what make, model or specification it was, it looks like we'd have to strip down the entire bike to try and get a look at it. But it was just a short, stubby suspension unit that bolted onto the bottom end of the chassis backbone, and at the bottom of the shock it had a kind of small dogleg linkage that mated it onto the Monopro swing arm. Now, even when we removed the bike's bodywork, we'd still have to take off the air filter trunking and remove the bike's plastic fuel tank to even get a look at the suspension unit, let alone remove it for any maintenance. But you can just about grab a quick glimpse of the shock's red outer spring that sits just in front of that plastic fuel tank. So this part of the bike, as you can gather, doesn't look like it's something that you could change in just 5 minutes. Even so, as I mentioned earlier in the video, the bike's bodywork, well, this fuel tank cover at least, it was manufactured in fiberglass, and I think it weighed only just a few ounces, although the JCM's rear mudguard was made of much more pliable plastic, so it did manage to take a bit more punishment than its more brittle fiberglass parts. But up at the front of the bike, it was much the same scenario with regards to this front mudguard that was also made from plastic, and this part here was secured onto those Marzocchi forks by way of an alloy mounting plate and 2 bolts either side. So with the body panels and mudguards being constructed from both fiberglass and plastic, you can see that the body panels and the front and rear mudguards were also decked out in white with this JCM Europa livery, and it did give the bike a quite unique look, and it was certainly something different from the kind of machines that many of JCM's competitors were turning out at the time. And for a machine that's now 36 years old, I have to say the plastic and the fiberglass parts on this bike are still the originals and in fantastic condition for a bike from 1989. However, as we finally make our way onto the rider controls, you can see we've got a good pair of Renthal handlebars there to start with, and both of the grips on either end are Pro taper items. Now the throttle gasser is again another Italian-made Domino part, and this part here has the delicate job of controlling our gas JCM two-stroke engine when the bike's trying to negotiate or circumvent the many tricky obstacles that the bike will come across. But hopefully Deryck will remember to push that cable rubber back onto the end of the throttle cable before he enters for his next classic trial. And again here at the front we've got that Brembo front brake master cylinder there with its rubber cover and alloy brake lever, and also here on the clutch side it's once again an alloy ball end lever with a rubber Domino cable and lever pivot cover, just to try and help keep dust, dirt and moisture from entering the cable ends. So after taking all of the pictures and video clips of our JCM, we had just about enough time left to get Deryck, the bike's owner, to give it a quick fire up so that we could have a quick listen to what that JCM gas engine sounded like. Anyhow, as far as my research go, they say that there's still a museum dedicated to Joel Carroyan, to the many models of JCMs that he built during his short manufacturing existence, and that museum is located at Joel's old Trial 70 bike shop premises in Vesoul in the centre of France, and also that museum is said to house the very JCM bike that French rider Charles Coutard rode when he scaled the first two floors of the Eiffel Tower back in 1983. Although it seems that after Strife's takeover of JCM and the subsequent selling off of what remained of the JCM bikes, it's more or less where this particular story ends, because there doesn't appear to be any more updates or information about what happened to the company afterwards. And although our JCM was a decent enough bike, I don't think JCM could just compete with the might of the bigger Japanese and European manufacturers, which, as you already know, is a well-documented story when it comes to motorcycle manufacturing. But as I mentioned at the start of this video, the bike's owner, Deryck Scott, has now decided to sell his JCM because he's already got his eye on its replacement. So if you think that this bike here is maybe something that you might be interested in as a piece of rare trials history, then why not give Deryck a message at this email address so that you can get some more details about the bike's background. And so there you have it, another super rare trials bike and a machine that up until I actually went out to film it, I never knew who JCM was or even who was behind the brand. But I suppose that's the great thing about looking at these older classics, because you're learning something brand new every time and re-educating yourself with past motorcycle history. But for me personally, I still think that this 89 JCM 240 Europa is more of a collector's item than a serious daily weekend racer, because very few of these JCMs were made, and this one here is in superb original condition, and without doubt it would make a very worthy addition to anybody's motorcycle collection.